We continue with our discussion of The Dawn of Everything by David Graeber and David Wengrow. This is the sixth part of our interpretation. Today marks the final part on this book. It does not aim to retell the entire history of humankind but rather explores the origins of history, particularly the origins of human inequality. It is a challenge to the deeply influential theory put forth by Rousseau in the 18th century. The authors start from the perspective of inequality, but the more they research, the more they realize that freedom is the more fundamental concept. Early humans and indigenous peoples often practiced a dual-year system. They could tolerate inequality intermittently, but they seem to have always possessed three fundamental freedoms. 1. Freedom of movement. If I dislike this community, I can leave at any time because I know that distant communities will welcome me. 2. Freedom to ignore or disobey orders. No matter how powerful a chief is, he can only lead me, not force me. 3. Freedom to reshape or switch between different social realities. I understand that the freedom of movement is the most fundamental freedom, while the freedom to disobey is a general social norm of early humans. These two freedoms ensure the third freedom. Now, we must answer the final question. Early humans were free. How did they later lose their freedom and end up in a state of permanent inequality? Everything was going well, then suddenly, someone monopolized the use of violence in society and declared themselves the supreme king. Why did everyone tolerate this? The old view suggests that, as society becomes more complex, bureaucratic institutions become necessary for governance, laws must be enforced, and violence is required to uphold the authority of the law. Otherwise, society would collapse into a Hobbesian war of all against all. By now, you already know that this argument is flawed. In reality, early societies were never just small groups. They frequently gathered in the tens of thousands, lived permanently in cities, and were fully capable of self-governance. Now, imagine yourself as a time traveler, arriving in a prehistoric community in 4000 BCE. You find that these people live abundantly, with plentiful resources. You aspire to achieve greatness and become king. You want supreme status, power, and glory. You want absolute obedience. When you speak, your words must become law. You also want your descendants to inherit the throne forever. But the people around you simply don't buy into your vision. This community is highly autonomous, and the three great freedoms are deeply ingrained. Ordinary people go about their daily lives, helping each other when needed, with no necessity for a king. So how do you make it happen? Graeber and Wengrow propose that there are three ways to gain dominance. 1. Violence. Imagine an armored truck on the street. Everyone knows it is full of cash, yet no one dares to rob it because armed guards are present. Violence is the most direct and effective form of power. Some even argue that state sovereignty is nothing more than monopolized violence. But relying on violence alone is not enough. 2. Control of information. If only you know where the treasure is hidden, no one else can take it. If only you can interpret the cracks on oracle bones, the king must respect you. If you control the tax records, knowing how many people and how much land each household has, you can govern effectively. As Harari noted, bureaucracy thrives on intersubjective realities. Information control is its secret weapon. 3. Personal charisma. This is a raw and primal mechanism of power. If you are the strongest fighter, the most eloquent speaker, or the most beautiful, and people believe that such excellence entitles you to power, then you naturally acquire authority. Ancient societies worshipped heroes, but Graeber and Wengrow argue that, even in modern democratic elections, the public is not truly making political decisions. They are simply selecting charismatic figures. Modern governments typically consolidate all three elements: violence, military force, information control, bureaucracy, and personal charisma, a great leader. But these must be acquired step by step. Let's examine some historical cases to learn from. If you want to establish power through violence, you must be a formidable warrior yourself, and your followers must be equally formidable. The best way is to conquer other tribes. Building a reputation for strength while acquiring free wealth, especially captives who can serve you. If an institution is established, you no longer need to fight personally. Your subordinates can do it for you. And if the institution matures, people will fear you without you having to act at all. Eventually, you may possess an unrestricted, absolute right to take lives. In the early 18th century, in what is now Canada, there was an indigenous group called the Natchez. Their leader was known as the Great Sun, and he could order the execution of anyone at any time, and the people would obey. But the Great Sun's power was actually quite limited. People invented various ways to constrain him. For example, since he was so esteemed, he was too sacred to touch the ground. Therefore, roads had to be laid before he walked, meaning he couldn't travel freely. More fundamentally, people simply avoided being around him. The Great Sun settlement, referred to by French observers as the Great Village, had very few inhabitants. The logic was clear. If you are too powerful, we will keep our distance. Thus, someone who relies solely on violence is like a spoiled child, unable to truly govern a large population. To gain broader obedience, personal charisma and bureaucratic control are necessary. In ancient times, both personal charisma and bureaucratic knowledge were often tied to grand rituals, particularly religious ceremonies. For instance, you could gain fame by excelling in public competitions. The classical Maya and later the Aztecs had such contests, similar to gladiatorial games in Rome, or even ball games. Winning these competitions earned one the same kind of admiration modern sports stars receive. However, a safer and more effective path was to assume the role of a host during grand ceremonies. Organizing large-scale sacrificial rituals required sophisticated administrative skills, and the earliest bureaucratic records were used to manage the labor involved in these preparations. Gaining power through violence, information control, or personal charisma can grant temporary dominance. Some ancient societies relied on just one of these mechanisms. However, such power structures were unstable. When religious ceremonies ended, the leader's authority often faded, and people reverted to their seasonal way of life. So how could power become permanent? The origins of the Egyptian state provide insight. Ancient Egyptians were obsessed with the afterlife long before the formation of their kingdom. They placed great importance on funeral rites and even sacrificed war captives to accompany deceased leaders. During the early Egyptian kingdom, a ruler came up with an idea. Instead of only burying war captives with the deceased king, he decreed that the late king's close attendants, including family members and officials, should also be sacrificed. This set a precedent. Those who served the king were no longer independent individuals. They were part of his property, like war captives. Perhaps this was because Egyptian culture deeply revered the dead, embracing death as a noble fate. The next step in this process was the construction of massive pyramids. After all, a pyramid is just a tomb. But the Egyptians accepted it. Building pyramids required the mobilization of vast labor forces, working continuously for many years. This meant that for all those years, the laborers, though driven by religious belief, were in effect willingly serving the king. To keep them content, the king might offer feasts on holidays and host celebrations for construction milestones. These gestures were secondary. The key was securing long-term control over a large number of people. But this was not the end. The deceased needed food in the afterlife. Would ordinary food suffice for offerings? Of course not. The food for the dead had to be special delicacies, such as fermented bread and beer made from wheat. Producing these required large-scale wheat cultivation, making casual farming practices unsustainable. Thus, the first professional farmers in human history emerged. All of this was done in the name of faith. The Inca Empire in Peru followed a similar pattern. While maize originated in the Americas, the Incas did not eat it regularly. It was considered a high-status food. By the time the Spanish arrived, maize beer had already become a sacred offering to the gods. As a result, every household was required to grow maize. The poor, unable to afford it, had to borrow from royal estates to meet their obligations to the ancestors, falling into debt and, in some cases, even slavery. Now, let's revisit the phrase from Zhuozuan. The great affairs of a state lie in sacrifices and warfare. When we also consider the concept of an imagined community, the implications are profound. Why are sacrifices and warfare the two great affairs of a state? Because without them, the state has no reason to exist. Ordinary people lived well enough on their own. Villages could govern themselves. Why did they need a king? Because the king represented the imagined community. It was the concept of the nation that led people to imagine that those faraway individuals, regardless of age or gender, were their enemies, that their ancestors constantly watched over them and must be honored with offerings. That the king was the son of a god, ruling by divine mandate. To ensure a smooth and prosperous life, to seek divine protection, people had to obey the king and serve him. How did the bureaucratic system extend into rural areas? Before states existed, Mesopotamian villages of about 150 people had already developed rudimentary record-keeping, using seals or knotted strings, though they lacked formal writing. These records tracked contributions to communal tools and labor shortages in a system of village self-governance. The purpose was not taxation but mutual aid. If one household lacked labor, the village helped. If the old chief owed someone a few bowls of grain, a record was made. And if the debt remained unpaid at year's end, it was often forgiven in a communal spirit. Then one day, an official from above arrived, announcing the need for soldiers for war and laborers for pyramid construction. Every village had to contribute men and grain. Since the village already kept records, the official simply appropriated them. Ignoring the context of local mutual aid and enforcing an impersonal bureaucratic demand. Previously, these records had been humanized. The bureaucratic system merely exploited them while erasing their humanity. This was the origin of the state. This concludes the story presented in The Dawn of Everything. Graeber and Wengrow never explicitly state how inequality arose, so based on the hints throughout the book, I propose the following hypothesis. From the moment early humans became Homo sapiens, their lives were already complex, and their minds were not simple. There were conflicts, but also ways to resolve them. They lived under a dual system. For part of the year, they formed small hunting bands led by a chief. During this time, there was a clear hierarchy, and everyone followed the chief's commands. But after the hunt ended, all the groups reunited for a grand festival and lived together for several months. During this period, the chief lost his authority, and equality was restored. Wars and killings existed, but within each tribe, equality prevailed. People enjoyed broad freedoms. Freedom to migrate, freedom to disobey orders, and freedom to choose their social structures. Starting around 12,000 BCE, as the planet warmed and populations grew, cultural regions became smaller due to division and differentiation. Neighboring tribes grew wary of each other, sometimes even hostile, reducing migration freedoms. Wars became more frequent, and in war, hierarchy was inevitable. Yet societies still practiced the dual system. Harsh on captives, but maintaining equality among their own people. Religious rituals grew increasingly significant. Hunter-gatherer customs allowed for the sharing of all goods, except for sacred objects and the right to perform religious roles, which were inviolable. Highly respected or strikingly attractive individuals were temporarily chosen as kings for rituals. During festivals, these kings wielded immense power, even deciding matters of life and death, but their authority was temporary. Once the ceremony ended, everyone returned to equality. But there was a loophole: war captives. Within the tribe, people were equals, but captives could be kept as permanent slaves. Having no roots in the local community, captives had no choice but to depend entirely on their captors. By taking in captives, and possibly also orphans, the disabled, and even dwarfs, a leader could build a personal faction loyal only to him. To reinforce this system, the leader might sacrifice all of his predecessors' captives upon the old king's death. Then, by making rituals more elaborate and extending the preparation time, the temporary role of ritual kingship became permanent. Through the construction of an imagined community, the state was established, and systemic oppression began. Our lesson from this history? None of this was inevitable. The moment we recognize that religious ceremonies are not essential, that the state should not serve as an intermediary between people and the divine, but as a social contract serving the people, the foundations of inequality will begin to crumble. That's it for today's content. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.
If you feel there is value in this, please like, subscribe to this channel, and leave your thoughts or suggestions in the comments section. Let's grow together and read more good books.